Hello, everyone. Dave and Tiff back with you for another Dave and Tiff Sports podcast. And we've got some interesting stuff to talk over because here this week, as we record on December 7th, Pearl Harbor Day, some interesting things have happened over the weekend. We will have as our special guest today, as we always say, if you're watching on Facebook, look at Tiff's background. That is always a clue. Head coach for the men's basketball team for the HPU Sharks, DARREN VORDERBRUEGGE, as well as women's basketball coach, REID TAKATSUKA. So this will be an HPU, kind of a HPU preview show, if you will. And Tiff, you know, we always talk about the major colleges, but here in Hawaii, Division II, you know, they have a pretty big footprint here because you have three schools here, Chaminade and University of Hawaii Hilo, part of the Pac-West Division II. So there's always a lot of concern. And as much as people were talking about college sports getting underway, if you look at the Pac-West, there was even more concern there because of the fact there's limited resources with those schools. But fortunately, there will be a basketball season happening at least come January. So we'll talk with both guys about that. I'm sure they're going to be very happy about that as well.
I'm sure they're very happy. I'm also curious to see if they were able to catch some of the NBA bubble and to just see kind of what their thoughts were on that, and also of seeing games on the Division I slate that have either gone on or have been postponed or just flat out canceled because of COVID. So just to see and get to hear their thoughts on how everything related to basketball has been going on for them since they've been on hiatus since this past March.
Yeah, they will have, I'm sure, more challenges than Division I counterparts because of their lack of resources. We'll talk with them about that. But, you know, you mentioned NBA bubble, and there is an interesting article that came out on ESPN is the fact, and I was thinking about this, NBA season is going to start just before Christmas. So I think the first game is slated for December 22nd. So that is a very quick turnaround when you think about it. The end of the NBA Finals, they played on October 11th, the Lakers and the Heat. So the article was about the disparity in terms of the break or off-season between teams, because you kind of have three groups of teams here. You have the teams that didn't even restart in the bubble, and there were 8 of them. They have the longest off-season. Then you have a second group that went into the bubble but didn't make the playoffs. Then you have a third group that was in the bubble, made the playoffs, so they played longer. And then if you go with the Heat and Lakers, they played the longest. So here it is. Catch this. So if you didn't even make the bubble, your break since end of your season, which was in March, until the start of the next season was 287 days almost.
Wow. Did you count all those days?
No, there are other smarter people who did that. Now, if you made the bubble but didn't make the playoffs, 131 days of break since the last game you played. For those that made the or let's just go with the Lakers and the Heat, who played the longest, their break since the end of the game of the championship finals on October 11th until the start of the season is about 71 or 72 days. So you have the longest break of 287, and the shortest of 71. The average normal break or off season for NBA from finals until start of the season is about 141 days. So the concern is this huge disparity between these groups of teams and how it'll affect players, the cohesiveness. And then you look at older players like LeBron James, who played the longest, won a title, and will have the shortest amount of recovery time. And you got to wonder, Tiff, how the NBA season is going to start. I'm guessing there's going to be a lot of load management with stars.
Well, we've already heard that LeBron says he's not going to be playing for most of these games. Well, not most of these games, but for a few of these games, he's not going to be playing. And you think about, say, Gordon Hayward, who now is with the Charlotte Hornets. You think of now Russell Westbrook now going to the Eastern Conference and going to the Washington Wizards, and has probably made that team a playoff team. So it's going to be interesting, like you said, to see how teams that were right on the cusp of making the bubble but didn't even make it them having that type of rest, then you add in players that weren't with their team to now, how is everything going to be working out for all these teams once the season starts on December 22nd?
You know, the king of load management, Kawhi Leonard, I'm thinking he's not going to play until about May.
Well, I mean, you think of him, and it just seems like we go back to LeBron, who just signed a 2-year deal. AD gets a 5-year max with the Lakers, and you just think that you hate to throw out the word dynasty with your team in Los Angeles, but you just think that they have a good probability, maybe not to win or at least get to the finals, but at least be a very, very strong contender in the Western Conference. And I think for the Lakers, yes, I know 2019, 2020 NBA bubble champions, just like your LA Dodgers, but it'll just be interesting to see which games LeBron picks and chooses to play, but also to see other players that did quite well in the bubble. I'm thinking of Kentavious Caldwell-Pope. I'm thinking of Mr. Caruso and his headband. They did quite well. Yes, you don't have Danny Green anymore, but your Lakers look quite good, gotta say.
Yeah, and then I think if you're a fan, though, you got to be very accommodating to the fact that a lot of the stars will, in fact, not be playing a lot, if at all, on certain games into the beginning part of the season because of the break in and of itself. Let's switch gears a little bit to a story that kind of hits close to home in terms of Hawaii here. McKenzie Milton, the University of Central Florida quarterback who over the weekend decided to enter the transfer portal. So he's going to transfer out of UCF and look elsewhere. So the story obviously being that he hasn't played since 2018 when he had that devastating leg injury, almost lost his leg, has recovered to the point where he was running the scout team at UCF. Now,
amazing.
Fellow Mililani High School alum Dylan Gabriel has become the starting quarterback as a sophomore. So McKenzie Milton just kind of read the writing on the wall, if you will, and says, look, I can still play. I got one more year, but I don't want to challenge Dylan, who seems to be entrenched as a starting quarterback. So he's going to look elsewhere. But
the torch has been passed, as he said in that tribute video. And I don't know if you were able to catch that video, but if you have not, set aside some time, because it is maybe some of the best 7-8 minute video footage that UCF has put out there. And believe me, they have put out some very good social media and just video content. But also remember to have some tissue, Sandy, because it can get a little teary-eyed.
Yeah, and I haven't seen it yet, but I plan to. But, I mean, it was a very emotional, sentimental, written thing that he sent out there, and he was very thankful for his time. But it tells me this. First of all, the question was, would he ever play football again? And it seems the fact that he wants to transfer and, you know, look for a school to play with, it tells me that he and his doctors are telling him and giving him the real thumbs up, saying, you can play. You can not just run scout team in practice. You can play competitively. And whether he wanted to challenge Dylan Gabriel next season for the starting quarterback, I think he just didn't want to because of his relationship with Dylan, his relationship with the coach and the team. And he just felt, I don't want to create controversy. I just want to start anew. And that tells you several things about McKenzie. A, that by golly, he has really rehabbed well. And B, he just wants to start anew and doesn't want to create any, because he could very well have a lot of sentimental forces if he decided to stay one more year with UCF and try and compete again. But Dylan is the man. I'm going to look elsewhere.
And the first thing that McKenzie has said the last couple of years now that DG, as he's called him, has been the starter, he said he's the guy. The torch has been passed. And he has no ill will of Gabriel, who has taken over the starting spot and has flown with it. But for all that McKenzie has done, it's a testament to his mom and dad, who have raised such a quite young man. But also don't forget that he is going to graduate with his degree. He is going to get his sports and exercise science major. He's going to get his diploma. His ultimate goal, as a lot of young athletes are, and a lot of kids that are in college, their goal is to get to that next level. And for him to be on the sidelines, that's not going to get him to his ultimate goal, which is to be a quarterback, whether it is a starter or as a clipboard guy in the NFL. And it's not going to happen if he is behind Gabriel at UCF next season. Is he going to go to Nebraska, where Scott Frost, his former coach at UCF, is now at Nebraska? We don't know. But if you're a head coach and you may be on the hot seat and you aren't pleased with how your quarterback is playing this season, or if you're not happy with who you have in the stable of your quarterbacks, maybe you give a shot to Mackenzie Milton in 2021.
But, I love Mackenzie, but that's still a gamble for any coach to take him. You just don't know how well and how physically well he is. I mean, he hasn't been tested on the field. So that will be, I'm sure he's going to go through a battery of tests before any coach signs him. But good luck to Mackenzie in his future. And I kind of think Scott Frost at Nebraska will be the one to sign him up. One final quick thing. How's about the New York Jets?
Why are we talking about the Jets? They're 0-12. Steven Tsai's not here. Gary Dickman's not here.
But the way they lost this last game, they fired Greg Williams, their defensive coordinator, because they were seconds away from their first victory. The Raiders had to just do a Hail Mary, and Greg Williams calls this crazy defensive play where he blitzes 9 players and one-on-one on the other side. So they didn't do the prevent on the Hail Mary. Raiders throw for a touchdown. Is Greg Williams that good that he gets signed with teams? Because he seems like I wouldn't touch him with a 10-foot pole. He doesn't get along with head coaches. He soured his relationship with Sean Payton in New Orleans. He didn't get along with Adam Gase here in New York. I kind of thought when I heard that, I said, this is Greg Williams saying, I don't give a rip. We're going to get fired because Adam Gase is going to get fired. I'm just going to throw this play at him and just stick another needle into the New York Jets head coach, Adam Gase, saying, yeah, we suck.
Well, I know there are a lot of people out there that would love to have a job, let alone be one that is a defensive coordinator for a professional football team. I know he has a lot of free gear that you just talked about, some of the teams that he's been previously at. And, we all know that the prevent defense prevents you from winning. You're preventing yourselves from winning. But if you're going to call an all-out blitz, at least send all 8 at the same time, as opposed to sending 7, then sending a linebacker late who basically does nothing, and you're relying on your three defensive backs to do one job, and that's knock it down. But when Henry Ruggs is out there, and we know how fast he is, all Carr's got to do is just float it up. You saw what happened. The Raiders stay alive, and the Jets 0-12.
I'm glad he got fired.
And there's a 30% chance of them going 0-16 for the season. They're at Seattle, they're at the Rams, they face Cleveland, and then they're at New England. We all saw what New England did yesterday in Inglewood against the Chargers. The Chargers, those powder blues are sweet. I love them. I'm a San Diego Charger fan. I'm not an LA Charger fan. Chargers have quit. And I feel for Anthony Lynn because he is a darn good coach. And his team has given up on him. But yes, the Jets, oh my goodness. Stop talking about them.
Yeah, I'm glad Williams got fired. That was a lame play, and I'm glad he's done. Award-winning Hawaii sports writer Cindy Lewis shares her love of volleyball and other sports topics with her new website, cindylewis.com. After nearly 40 years of covering the top events in Hawaii, Cindy brings her reporting flair and insight to the digital format for all to enjoy. Get the very latest information on University of Hawaii volleyball for all teams, women, men, and beach, from one of the most respected journalists in the state. Go to cindylewis.com and you will be connected. Well, as part of our HPU preview, if you will, we got head coach of the men's basketball team, head coach DARREN VORDERBRUEGGE. And, Coach, first of all, thanks for joining us. And I'm going to start off with this question because it's always pandemic related in terms of college sports. But I can't imagine for you guys how, because of your resources compared to Division I, you're already kind of limited on that. HPU is in Hawaii, which is already hard to recruit. Did recruiting get hit kind of the hardest in terms of level of difficulty when it comes to impact of the pandemic?
Well, that's a great question. I really think that HPU, I hate to say this, is almost at an advantage because, one of the first impacts that recruiting had was you could not go and recruit off of, they made it a quiet period. So coaches couldn't go out and watch. And they also made it so that student athletes could not do official visits. Well, we didn't do a lot of that to start with. And to a certain degree, it kind of leveled the playing field. It is so expensive for us to fly over for a weekend of AAU basketball in Anaheim, and even more expensive to get to Denver. Whereas at all of those events, there are so many coaches who get in their Camrys and drive for 4 or 5 hours and watch those. And it cost them a tank of gas and a Wendy's hamburger. And so that, in that sense, we were kind of used to, hey, we got to do more on video. We for years have not been doing many official visits, but been Zooming with parents. And, we used to call it Skype.
Yeah.
But so I think in a sense that played as a little bit of an advantage, or at least leveled the playing field.
And I got to talk to you too, is that last season, although as weird as it was the way it ended, it was the first year of having your own facility, the Shark Tank, which was the old St. Francis School gym. So I know there was a lot of excitement to that. Did it seem a little anticlimactic in a way, the way the season ended? Because there was all the excitement, having crowds there, practices. You didn't have to do as much work logistically in terms of coordinating practice, which that's how I got to know you. I used to work at Palama Settlement. You would practice there. Then you had games at either Blaisdell or Moanalua. Suddenly, oh my gosh, we don't have to do all that stuff. And then pandemic hits and it kind of ends the season, cuts it short a little bit, and then you have more work to do, I guess, in terms of dealing with all that. Was it a little anticlimactic the way it ended last year?
Yeah, it was so surreal in so many ways. And yeah, you and I'm glad you bring it up, Dave, but we met years ago at Palama Settlement, and a shout out to that terrific organization and all the good that they do. It was, I don't know what words to use, invigorating, energizing to get our own facility. People snicker and roll their eyes when I tell them about us. Okay, we're loading up the basketballs to go to college basketball practice, and we're having to take our, the equipment we use and the rebound rim and waiting until the line dancers get off the court that have rented it till we can get on. And yeah, it wasn't real glamorous, as you and I both know.
Oh yeah.
But not to be concerned about the glamour, just the freedom and to get on the court, to get extra time for the young men, to have your emblem painted on the court and feel like you've got a home court. It was so good. The weird part about last year for me was kind of unique in the sense of our women had an incredible year last year. The HPU Lady Sharks had, I think, one loss overall. So they were one of the top seeds in they were the number 1 seed, and we got to host regionals. So my birthday is March 13th. I think that was the day, as you kind of hear that day referred to. And I remember being in the gym, and the night before, Thursday night, they had canceled the NBA. And that Friday, we were in the gym, and there were 8 teams coming in to have practice that day. And then the next day start the national tournament, I can remember we were in full court mode. At that point, the men's season was over, and I was just trying to support our women's team and our administration to host the regional. And I remember saying that day, I'm not right very often in life. So whenever I am, I remember it. I remember coming in and saying, are these teams going to practice today? And somebody said, yeah, the tournament starts tomorrow. And I said, how can the NBA cancel and yet we're going to be allowed to play basketball, Division II women? And so sure enough, we got into about the middle of the first practice and the world stopped turning, and it was just so, the big thing I felt was those girls. I mean, there were teams all over that had really good years, but the personal experience of knowing those young women and Coach REID thinking, this is a once in a lifetime opportunity that just got pulled out from under them.
No,
Coach, I gotta ask, because I know that it's tough to do scheduling, whatever level you're on, whatever gender you're coaching, but to have a lot of, say, your D1 friends that have been having to basically schedule on the fly, and now things are getting either canceled or postponed, teams are pausing activities. What have you heard from other D1 coaches about just how tough it is to patchwork a schedule before conference?
I think most coaches that I've talked to have taken a deep breath and said, okay, we want to really be ready. We want to get our team as competitive as they can be. And coaches only have one gear, and that is let's practice and get as good as we can get. But you do have to take a deep breath and say, we hope we can play whatever modified conference schedule has been provided, and the rest is kind of icing on the cake. Now, I'm not talking to Bill Self and Mike Krzyzewski and Tom Izzo. I'm talking more to, what would be called mid-major, low major, and other D2 coaches who've kind of taken that step back and said, what we can do, we can do. And it's so unique because for the first time ever, we're very regionalized, or almost 50 independent states. Like, okay, well, these California schools, they can't do this. They can't eat outside at a restaurant. And in Kansas, it's hard to find somebody wearing a mask in places. So everything's back. It's all over the map. And you're, the whole thing that, a big part for Hawaii, again, for UH and Hilo, Chaminade, and ourselves are people don't want to fly. I mean, right now, it's always been expensive to fly, but now there's this added stigma of you going to your administration at your college and saying, we want to load up on an airplane and fly somewhere to go play a basketball game. Well, the thing that a lot of people don't think about there too is, let's say you do fly. Let's say that we would fly somewhere or a team would come here. What happens if someone tests positive? And then is that person, you got to get a hotel room, and imagine us going over to play a game in California and someone tests positive. Well, you can't get that person on a plane and bring them home. They would need a 14-day quarantine, and there's an expense, and then who stays back and supervises. So what a mess.
It really is a mess. And for what is very tough with the Pac West is that most of the schools are in California, and there's, the situation like you talked about where, certain states are acting, differently than others, but it's just tough because you have a lot of schools in Northern California and in Southern California, but it's also been something for you guys where when you go and travel, you're playing 3, 4, 5 games per road trip. Do you get a sense of that being what's going to continue to happen for this shortened season?
My feeling right now, the information I'm getting, what's being seriously considered is that maybe the Pac West will play in pods, and this is all tentative, but I think it's the lead idea going around right now, that the Northern California teams would play each other, the Southern California teams would play each other, and the Hawaii teams would play each other. I'm still mad at BYU Hawaii for cutting athletics because that cuts us down to 3 schools.
No kidding.
But that we would play each other too many times, and then maybe at the end of that, try to evaluate, hey, is there a road trip that can be taken? Because now you're talking maybe the end of February, early March, if we can, cobble some pod games together in January and February, and then look at a trip. I think they're probably talking about maybe the winners of each pod or who would be determined a champion getting together and looking at a conference tournament. But, I think we've all learned that you've got to make plans right now and then kind of wait a week or 2 weeks and see where you're at again. We've seen that just in politics, in opening up Hawaii for tourism. We set the date and then we moved it, and then you set another date and you reevaluate. So I think that is the idea that we'll try right now.
We're talking with head coach of HPU men's basketball, DARREN VORDERBRUEGGE. And, Coach, as you just mentioned to the fact that there's a lot of basically a wait and see, a lot of uncertainty in everything. You can plan for this, but there's always have to be a plan B, plan C kind of ready on the table. I often wondered, as a coach, this must really test your skills in terms of motivation. I mean, there's all the X's and O's, there's a game prep, but when you have this element of uncertainty that is really extending, you got to motivate your players and keep that cohesion there, because you can't tell them anything. Hey, coach, when are we playing? I don't know. Hey, coach, when is our first road trip? I have no idea. So has that really tested the element of motivation for you?
It has to a certain degree, and that's insightful because you're right. Young men want to play games. That's what the effort is for. What I've also learned, two things. Number one, we got such a late start. Throughout September and pretty much October, we were not allowed to do much. At one point in October, this is going to sound like a joke with no punchline, we were allowed to work 4 student athletes at a time outdoors at a park without a basketball. So that was our first entry into me even being able to have contact with them. So
oh, wow.
we're over at Pu'unui Park doing defensive slides and sit-ups and high knees. It's like, what? But my point, Dave, is that because of that, when we were able to get on the court with mask into full practice mode, I've continued to remind them weekly, hey, we might not know when our first game is and we might not be suiting up, but we're not at the park doing defensive slides. So let's make the most of it at this point. And then the second thing is, it's reiterated to me, young men love to play basketball and they want to compete. So we've looked for ways for them to compete and keep score during practice and things like that. So, and I think we're going to have a game with UH before Christmas break. And we're really excited about that. Just a chance to, we know they're going to be really good and all the money's going to be on them. And that's how it should be. That's why they're D1 and we're D2. But hey, that just a chance to play a game is so valuable.
Not that we condone how people spend their money on certain activities, right, Coach?
That's right. That's right.
Coach, I got one more for you. I'm not sure how much of the NBA bubble you got to see, but I just wanted to just kind of get your thoughts on what you saw from watching the bubble, and also if your team was put into a bubble-like situation, whether it was just in the Hawaii pod or if, say, the Pac-West kind of relocated to a different venue and just kind of had like a bubble format of a conference season, just to see how you think your team could perform in a bubble-like scenario.
Now, I watched quite a bit of that. There wasn't a lot of other sports options on TV during that time, but it was good basketball. The Heat, the Celtics, I really enjoyed their style of play. I thought they both guarded, and it was fascinating. One observation, I kind of thought that you could sense that the teams were not as tired. There was no travel between games. Everybody was going back to their room right after the game that they were comfortable with. I mean, it wasn't back to their house, but I was fascinated also by that they were, you would compete against somebody and maybe even talk some trash and have some negative energy, and then have to go sit by them at the pool or run into them in the hallway. And that was just something you never thought you'd see at that level. We have, I don't know how my guys would perform in that situation, but we are in a bubble of sorts. I mean, I just lecture them every day, guys. You understand, if one of you tests positive, we're done for 2 weeks. I mean, I'm pretty sure that something along those lines will happen. So continuing to encourage them to just lay low and be below the radar. I think Hawaii's a pretty good place for that right now, based on the other people I'm talking to. There's more large outdoor gatherings, and there's a little more aggressive attitude in some states. And here, our rates are relatively good, but I think we would bubble if we were on the road. I mean, we've already talked about, we wouldn't ride a public transportation to the airport. We'd only be our team. We'd try to sit together on the airplane. We'd get to the hotel. We would not go out for meals, order them all in, which is just bizarre. But if that's what you got to do to get some games in, then that's what we would do.
Hey, last thing, Coach. How are you guys? What's the protocols you guys are following now? Like, how often are you and your players either being tested and all that kind of stuff?
Yeah, we're tested 3 times a week. We were once a week for a while, and now that we've gotten into the heart of the season, we are tested 3 times a week on campus. We do a saliva test and mail that to the mainland and get the results back in usually less than 48 hours. We're at the gym. There's no interaction with other teams. When the women's team practices or volleyball would practice before us, there's a grace period with a protocol of cleaning and desanitizing. We have people coming in and cleaning the restrooms multiple times a day.
Wow.
We're all wearing masks, the players and the coaches, throughout practice. So it's a different time, but we're making it work.
Well, I tell you what, first of all, thanks for taking the time to join with us. I know you probably got a practice coming up. And if anything, I think your players are going to be much more conditioned having to run around in a doggone mask the whole time. That must test the conditioning and the breathing of all your players.
I get worn out and catch myself gasping for breath just from yelling at them. So I know they got to be tired from running at it.
Over 30 years of experience of covering Hawaii sports and telling stories can be found with BedrockSportsHawaii.com. Hawaii sports writer Nick Abramo shares his passion for insight, news, and opinions, along with stories and tales in what he calls the inexhaustible universe of athletics. Football, surfing, hockey, yes, hockey, and wrestling are some of the featured content you will find on BedrockSportsHawaii.com. Well, as part of our HPU preview, if you will, here on the Dave and Tiff Sports podcast, we have the women's basketball head coach, REID TAKATSUKA, joining us here. And, Coach, first of all, thanks for joining us. And I know you have moved on from last season. I know that. But for me, I am still a little bit wrenched because, last season – first of all, the last 4 years, I was looking it up. You and your program has just been on fire, to say the least. Over the last 4 years, all 20-plus win seasons. Last season, of course, the Pac West tournament and regular season champions, ranked number 6 nationally, number 1 seed going into the West, hosting the NCAA tournament, West Regional. And just literally on the eve, I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, the eve of the first game of the tournament was the announcement that due to the pandemic, it was being shut down. And we talked with head coach DARREN VORDERBRUEGGE, and he was so excited for you guys leading up to this because, as Tiff has in his background, first season with your own facility. And there was a previous year, I believe it was 2017, 2018, where you guys were the number 1 seed in the West, but because you didn't have your facility, you had to go on the road. But in D2, if you're the number one seed in your region, you get to host. So here was this excitement to host the NCAA tournament, number one seed, only one loss in the season, and it gets literally like a punch in the gut. Okay, so I got all that off my chest. Did it get off your chest quicker than I did for you last season?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me on your show. I appreciate it. As far as this past season, it obviously stayed with me for a while, and obviously I think from my standpoint, it hurt more because I know how much it hurt my players. I know how excited it was for them to be hosting, and I think as a program, we all felt like we had the opportunity to win the region and move on and advance much further into the NCAA tournament. And I think all the things that happened, obviously, it was necessary. I think the safety of our players and, our school and just the state, I think was first and foremost. And I think, when you look at both sides of, the argument, it was a little easier to kind of get past it, knowing that, my players were safe and, we were moving in a direction that was going to kind of keep the state healthy and our program healthy.
Yeah, I tried to think that way too, and I did my best.
Didn't work out very well.
Yeah, it just kills me. And by the way, I mentioned just a little while ago how your team has really been on fire. I mean, your career, coach, has been just astounding, but especially the last 4 seasons. I just want to bring it out. 99-21 over the last 4 years. That's a .825 winning percentage. Pac-West champions, of course, last year. Tournament champions the year before. Pac-West regular season in 2018. Made the NCAA tournament in 2017. You are just behind Vince Gu in terms of number of wins for women's basketball for college in the state of Hawaii. I know you're one of those that don't look at all that kind of stuff, but when you kind of capsulize it, what I just said, is it one of those things where you're like, well, it was a lot of work, but I'm glad we're here, or hey, that's what we should be? I mean, how do you kind of look at all of that?
It's interesting because obviously when I hear the numbers, it's extremely surreal. Because I literally do not look at the numbers. I understand what our teams have accomplished over the last so many years, but from a personal standpoint, I mean, it's important, I guess, now that I'm hearing it, but at the same time, it doesn't resonate with me as I go into each season. Or even as I sit down and even think about seasons, I never think about records for whatever reason. I think the thing that I reflect on most as I look at past teams are the players that have come through the program. And I think a lot of the success that we've had as a program is because I think the kids that we've been bringing in are such great kids that it's just made my job significantly easier, and as far as like where we are now, I think there's, we've talked about it recently with our team now that there's a greater responsibility to maintain a level or a standard of excellence, being that, the former teams or the former players have kind of built the foundation for this team. And whether it's in a, COVID era or, a normal year, there's some expectations that are in front of us.
Coach, you talked about players that have come through the program, and then also how you felt more, you felt bad more for your players than you did for yourself after, you know, the pandemic shut down the Pac-West or the NCAA West Regional. To have a player like Star Rivera come through the program, not get a chance in the West Regional to continue her career. What can you say about having those local players that might not be the tallest, but have some of, you know, that have basically the most heart, you could say?
I think, you know, in Star's case, you know, what's interesting is that, you know, during this time, we've had obviously a lot of opportunity to reflect, and you know, Star's name has come up quite a bit, you know, and talk about a huge blessing for our program. And, you know, not just the fact that she's a local kid that did, I mean, extremely well for our program, but just a great representation and just a good person, you know, and legitimately, like in Star's case, you know, just, I mean, even now as I'm talking about it, still feel bad about it, you know, because the year that she was having, she was our leading scorer, you know, last year. And to reflect on where she came from and where she ended up, I just wish that, you know, we had that opportunity to keep moving forward, because I mean, it would have been a pretty awesome story for her, you know, in spite of, you know, all the things that happened. If we could have just kept going, you know, I think that would have been a pretty neat story.
You're born and raised here. You live out in Kaneohe, and you know, you're an alum of HBA, and there's another HBA alum who's doing quite well on the women's circuit. Talking about Jeff Harada up at Cal State Fullerton. To have a couple of head coaches with Hawaii ties, you included, what does it mean for Hawaii coaches to be doing well on the collegiate level, and then both to be able to say we're HBA alums?
Well, I mean, I just think that, I mean, coming from a small school like Hawaii Baptist Academy, I think it's pretty awesome that, you know, Jeff and I have been able to get, you know, not quite the biggest stage, obviously professional basketball, but I think that on the collegiate level, it's you know, pretty remarkable that he's at a Division I school right now and he's doing extremely well. And you know, from my standpoint, I like to think that we're doing okay. And I take, you know, and I talk to Jeff every week, and, you know, obviously we don't forget where we came from. And I think we take a great amount of pride in where we came from, and Hawaii is home. And even though he's in California right now, I mean, you know, we are in constant communication and we're always talking about home. And, you know, I think it's exciting from my standpoint to see where he is. You know, I am looking forward to him being successful at every single level that he's at, you know, so it's pretty exciting for me to see what he's doing at Cal State Fullerton.
We're talking with REID TAKATSUKA, the head coach of women's basketball at HPU. And first of all, let me get this very important question off my chest. You used to coach my co-host here, Tiff Wells, back in the day. And there was legend that I'd heard, so you got to clarify this, that back in the day, a young Tiff Wells who could walk in the gym apparently had some hops where he could touch the backboard where that white square is up above the rim. Is that true, or is that more legend?
I'm gonna say that it's mostly true. You know, I was with Tiff and coaching him in high school, and he was a baller, man. You know, he was getting it done. He knows what he's doing.
Oh, was it more?
You know, we got to be talking about rims that are maybe 7 feet high, because then you could just reach up and touch that backboard. And that's if we're talking, if that's legendary status, or if it really happened, if it's a 7-foot rim, I can touch that backboard. But getting to 10, no.
Oh, come on, man. Come on, Tiff. You're being modest, man.
The next question would have been, was it more elbows or actual defensive footwork? But that's for another show. You know, a little bit about last year's team as we segue into looking at this year's group, because last year's team was a young team. I believe only one senior with Star Rivera. So considering the success that you had last year, what's the look for this group for this coming season?
I think obviously, again, going back to expectations, I think the expectations and the standards haven't changed. I think the challenge for us right now is with coronavirus. We've had a few players opt out, so it's kind of changed the way we look. You know, and right now we're just trying to figure out how to fill in the gaps, which players are gonna be able to step into some big roles, and you know, kind of see what the season has in store for us. We're not really sure at this point, so we're just preparing as if we're gonna have a season, and you know, only time will tell. I mean, we're still fairly young, only 3 seniors. So I think that, you know, there's still some, you know, moments of looking pretty good, but we're a work in progress for sure.
Now, one scenario that we've heard, and obviously it hasn't been totally confirmed yet, is that the season will be played in some geographic pods. So that would mean there's a Hawaii pod of you guys, UH Hilo, and Chaminade, and just playing amongst each other. And then, of course, that's not confirmed, and there may be other scenarios. But if it were to be a Hawaii pod, playing 2 teams over and over reminds me of like KIF football. You know, on Kauai, you're playing 2 teams over and over again. And I'm guessing if you were to look at that as Plan A possibility, that lends the coach to have a lot more work in terms of motivation, because it's one thing to have strategy and game planning for multiple opponents, but when it's 2, that might be a challenge. Is that a challenge for you if that be the case?
I think it's a huge challenge. I think it's a huge challenge in large part because, you know, if you had to play the same teams, let's just say hypothetically 3 times, 4 times within a season, I think that, you know, different emotions or factors can come into play. And I just think that, I think you hit the nail on the head, just trying to motivate them to get up for the same team that you just saw maybe a week ago, and then knowing that you're going to play them again in another several weeks. I think it's extremely difficult. And I think it's difficult to get excited. I mean, even if it was, you know, going to Northern California and playing the same teams over and over again, I think it would be difficult, you know. And I just think that finding that motivation to get up for the same teams over and over again is probably the biggest challenge for sure.
Coach, you've been able to not only have 4-year players, but also have the ability to bring in those transfers from the Division I level. When you look at the transfer portal, and that's something everybody's been talking about the last couple of years, when you look at the portal and you're looking at players and stats and what schools they're transferring out of, what do you look for to maybe then ask them to see if they're interested in coming to HPU?
I think the biggest thing, well, the first thing that I bring up with all players is whether or not they're going to be okay with the distance of living in Hawaii. And I think the easy answer for a lot of kids is, well, what's not to like about Hawaii? But the fact of the matter is, you're 2,500 miles away, you know, possibly more. You know, it will affect how you feel at some point, you know, homesickness or just a different culture or whatever it may be. And I think, you know, once we can get past the distance and the travel, I think a big thing for me is looking for kids that fit into our system. I look for kids that can kind of do the things that I like to do as a coach, and at that point, you know, kind of get a feel for whether or not their goals are in line with our goals as a program. I think a lot of times with transfers, they have goals in mind, and a lot of times it doesn't necessarily line up with our team goals or our program goals. I'll give you an example. We had a kid that I was extremely interested in, a D1 kid, And her mindset was she wanted to start and she wanted to play 30 plus minutes. But if you look at our team last year, and I was honest with her, you're not going to start. You're not going to get those kind of minutes knowing the kids that I had coming back. And last year's team was 29-1. And I think that, under the certain, she obviously moved on and went to a different school, but, there was no place for her to start. We just had too many good players in place at that time. So I think you have to line up the players' needs and wants versus or against the program's kind of goals and needs. So that's kind of how I look at it.
REID TAKATSUKA joining us here on the Dave Tiff Sports Podcast, head coach of the HPU women's basketball team. By the way, 29-1 last season. That one loss that you alluded to came on a last-second shot with 0.7 seconds left. I believe it was a layup. So you're really 0.7 seconds from an undefeated season. So not to kind of add
you can tell
more
he's not happy about that still.
Yeah, add more to the gut punch. But last question, Coach. You're one of the few, and I talked to you about this before a game broadcast, and you told me the answer, and I thought it was interesting. But you're one of the few, if not the only, basketball coaches I've seen that actually stands at the end of the bench. And you joke to me that some of your friends and say, are you paying any attention? Are you just talking to the trainer at the end of the bench? But you have a reason why is it that you stand at the end versus like most coaches stand toward the front?
So the main reason is that when I was working for Jeff Harada, ironically, he was a guy that would coach standing up a lot of throughout the game. And a lot of times as I'm sitting next to him in the seat next to his, he would stand up and I could not see what was happening because he was standing right in front of me. And a lot of times I'm having to move back and forth trying to, take a look at the play, and he'd turn around and he'd ask me a question. And there were times that I didn't see what happened because he was standing right there. And so for me, when I first started, I just decided that I would stand at the end. That way my players and my assistants could see everything that was happening. And so if I did happen to ask my assistants, for an adjustment or something that was going on in the game, they actually could see what was happening. The other thing is I like to stand at the end of the bench as well because it gives me an opportunity to watch my players on the bench. Not that I'm, watching them and not watching the game, but it gives me an opportunity to see how engaged they are. And it also gives me an idea of who I may want to sub into the game. If they're into it, if some players may be daydreaming, I don't know, so it's kind of my way. It's definitely not traditional, but it works for me.
I would say it works, especially in your career.
29-1, yeah, 22-0 in the conference. It works.